You cannot enslave a mind that knows itself, that understands itself, that values itself. This quote by Kenyan environmentalist and Nobel Peace Prize laureate Mangai Matai demonstrates enslavement isn't a condition, but a state of mind. So in today's exegesis here, I'll be analyzing the text of the book An African History of Africa from the Dawn of Humanity to Independence. So I could go ahead and detail the valiant resistance of the woman of the Kingdom of Congo, both Kimpavita and Queen Njenga, against the Portuguese, but I won't. I could detail the military conquest of Shaka Zulu leading the Zulu people, but I won't do that either. Or I could go through the history of Lalibela recreating Jerusalem in Ethiopia out of solid rock, but I won't do that either. So instead of giving you guys detailed histories and genealogies and things of that nature, I'll venture to ask 3 questions for you guys so we can get a firmer grasp on the history of Africa. So the first question is, how complicit were Africans in their own enslavement across the globe? The second question is religion merely a tool used for conquest? And 3, how are African spirituality and beliefs passed down from generation to generation? So to begin, we'll go ahead and start with our first question here. How complicit were Africans in their enslavement across the globe? So let's go to page 325 here. Let's go to 325. Begin to answer this. So I'm going to begin where it is underlined, right? And actually, we'll get into 326 as well. So Africans were treated very differently in indigenous slavery compared to how they were put to use across the Atlantic, as 2 leading Ghanaian professors, Akasuwa Purby and Essie Sutherland Addy, explained to me at the University of Ghana in Accra. In indigenous slavery, war captives could be used as unpaid laborers, soldiers, and domestic servants, just as has been the case for centuries across Europe. An African male could be forced into enslavement to repay a debt, which was not dissimilar to practices of bonded labor in Asia and indentured labor and serfdom in Europe. Naturally, being an enslaved person in Africa meant hardship. Men had to toil on the land or in the mines for little or no recompense through their enslavement. Did not necessarily last a lifetime. In indigenous slavery, women could be acquired at slave markets, sought as wives to bear children, especially following times of war and high casualty rates, and to help with household chores. And in fact, women were more valued in indigenous slavery than men. In the transatlantic slave trade, men fetched a higher price because they were used as agricultural laborers. So I'm going to skip through here. So it speaks about how the process would go if a master would conceive with one of his lady slaves, and how they would classify them as slaves too. So right here, significantly, there was an absence of ideology of racism in indigenous slavery. The enslaver did not believe he or she was racially superior to their captives, and enslaved people were not regarded as subhuman. It was a matter of who happened to have power over whom. Nigerian Professor Miwa Fully from the University of Lagos expressed rather emphatically to me a commonly held view in Africa. It is more tolerable and acceptable for people of the same color to enslave one another. It is less visible, less tangible, and is not based on racism. The belief in the intrinsic inferiority of Africans, once widespread in Europe and in the Americans, could lead to the inhumane treatment that most enslaved Africans were subjected to. Nevertheless, the long-standing practice of indigenous slavery helped to enable the transatlantic slave trade because chattel slavery could build on and benefit from it, right? So this process of the transatlantic slave trade was basically the foundation that racism at its core was built on, right? So now we can go to page 336 here, just a few pages up. So some participated willingly while others were coerced. We can go to 337. So a common misconception is that Africans bartered their fellow Africans for trifling items or frivolous items. This may seem the case when viewed through a Western lens, but within African cultural system, objects deemed by Europeans to be of no consequence were ascribed value. For instance, Africans accepted beads as payment for humans because these were regarded as valuable goods by West Africans who used beads and shells as a currency and as a means of projecting wealth and prestige. So that is an example there of what we would barter for actual human beings here. Now, I'll get into this whenever I transition to the second question here, but whenever you open the gate of Hades, it's hard to close. So once you put a numerical or a fiscal value on a human being, you're now complicit in the trading of human beings, right? That is now what you are doing. So let's go to page 392. Let's go to 392 here. So the Portuguese agenda was economic gain. That's actually 391 here. So they had the agenda of economic gain here. And this will actually transition into our second question here. So the Portuguese had come with words of friendship and a spirit of cooperation, but very quickly the Africans grasped that their true agenda was economic gain at their expense, and that the Portuguese were, although more interested in trafficking enslaved people than spreading religion. At first, the enslaved people were prisoners of war and criminals, but then the Portuguese demands increased exponentially, leading to extensive slave raids throughout the kingdom. In 1514, special military campaigns and kidnappings were mounted with the specific objective of acquiring captives to sell. A new class of Portuguese-backed procurers called Pombeiros arose. Some were mixed race, some were pure African, but all endeavored to feed an ever more insatiable market for enslaved people. By 1520, the Kingdom of Congo was exporting up to 3,000 people per year. So Portuguese demands increased exponentially, leading to extensive slave raids throughout the kingdom. Again, once you open up the gates of Hades, it is a hard one to close, right? So whenever you start practicing the slave trade, again, you're already morally bankrupt, so people are just going to think, okay, these are morally bankrupt people, so we're just going to go ahead, we're going to perform these slave raids to get people for labor that we will need in our country. So let's go to question number 2. So is religion merely a tool used for conquest? Here it states they used a religious imperative as a Trojan horse to go ahead and enact their own economic desires here. So let's go to page 112 here. Let's go to page 112. 112. The concept of being converted was born out of the Abrahamic traditions. Also, most African languages did not have a word for religion. This new way of approaching religion brought a whole new type of conflict. So the author speaks about towards the beginning of the book how there's not really any recorded wars over religion of the indigenous African selection. That really didn't start happening until Judaism got there, till Christianity got there, till Islam got there, and that preempted this question. So let's go to 111 here. So following Azana's conversion, Christianity flourished in Aksum partly because it was embraced by the elite. Dr. Gebra Selassie told me there's no real evidence of resistance to Christianity nor proof that people were forced to adopt it. So this is very important because there's no force here in converting to Christianity. There's no force in it. I wanted to point out some quotes here that would conflict with what my belief was so I can strengthen my belief one way or the other, right? So let's go to page 162 here. After the defeat of Egypt, the local Christian Copts forged alliances with the Arab conquerors and were given their religious freedom, along with the Jews as well as al-Kitab, people of the book. This concept, well described in Islam, recognizes and respects fellow monotheists who share similar prophets and religious roots. Acceptance of the Arabs was facilitated by Jewish and Coptic resentment of the Byzantines' ruthless and punitive methods of collecting taxes. They coexisted with one another, and they were able to work things out. Let's go to page 212 here. So when economic conditions are tumultuous, religion becomes a rallying point and ideology here. This is very important. I'm going to read here all the way to the end of the chapter. The north of Nigeria is the poorest part in the country, and the emir believes this makes it easier for people to be co-opted into extremist views. He states, any serious attempt at understanding Islamic radicalization in northern Nigeria and the Sahel cannot avoid discussion of material conditions, poverty, lack of opportunity, hopelessness, and economic inequality in general. The emir also explained how adherents of extremist groups readily accept a narrative that pits Islam as being in confrontation with the West and Western values. Sometimes their violence is directed at real oppressors, while often it is directed at those who are not like us, those defined as other. Of course, not every poor Muslim is an extremist, and there are many militants who hail from affluent backgrounds in Africa and beyond. It is right that this jihadist group in the Sahel and elsewhere are defeated, but a long-term solution must look beyond forceful methods to issues of governance, economic inequality, social exclusion, marginalization, and perceived injustices. As the emir put it to me, certain social and economic conditions are fertile ground for breeding violent movements, be they religious extremists, ethnic militants, or criminal gangs. Religion simply becomes a rallying point and an ideology, but the real discontent lies in politics. How the fortunes of the Sahel have changed from the glorious days of Mansa Musa. So here what we're seeing is economic strife is what undergirds these violent extremist groups. So we see a lot of these violent groups, whether it's of a political selection, whether it's of a religious selection, or they're just criminals, right? It's all, economics undergirds all of it here, is what the author is saying. Now, I think there's more nuance to the ideal that religion is merely a tool for conquest, because religion is something that gives us comfort, gives us a way to organize ourselves, a way to understand the world in which we exist in. So the third question I have is, how are African spirituality and beliefs passed down from generation to generation? So let's go to page 25. Let's go to page 25. So each community has holy people. So in reality, most African traditional beliefs hold that ancestors exist in another world and can be invoked to intervene in present affairs. There are holy people in the community, spiritual entities who are intercessors between those on earth and those who have departed. There is a deep connection between the living and those in the afterlife. The dead still form part of the family and are offered prayers and sacrifices so good emanates from them back to earth. It is a very practical spirituality. There is no idea of hell awaiting sinners nor paradise awaiting believers. To give you guys a little bit of background on the African spirituality, there's no damning people to the underworld. Imagine that. Imagine you walk and exist in a world where you're not constantly condemning people to hell. Let's go ahead and go to page 191 here. So griot, we're going to be talking about griots. We're going to be talking about griots here. It looks like griot, but it's a griot. So Samaro Kant's virtues were praised by griots, and under his rule, the balafon, a kind of xylophone, and the dan, a four-string guitar, were invented. These were later used in praise songs. Griots are storytellers whose role is to extol the greatness of rulers, heroes, and heroines. The griot tradition still exists today, and these custodians of Africa's oral culture are an important source of African history. As the Nigerian Miwa fully explained to me, in most African cultures, individuals do not lay claim to knowledge. It is communal, which is why it is difficult to work out the provenance of information relayed by the storytellers. Excuse me there. There's griots who are basically the custodians of the information and are responsible for bringing forth the storytelling for the next generation to carry with them through their lives, right? So there's no written word, there's no written text. It is all through word of mouth. So let's go to page 391. So let's go to page 391 here. So 391. So we'll go a little bit up here. So the African traders were keen to obtain exotic textiles and novelties such as alcohol. Relations developed apace between the two. Ideas flowed with goods, and so profound was this exchange, and so assiduous the efforts of the Portuguese missionaries, that the king and his son Mavemba were baptized as Roman Catholics only 8 years later, in 1491. Mwine Congo took the name Jao first, and his name became known as Afonso. However, not all members of the royal family adopted Christianity. Another of the king's sons maintained his African religion, and even when the Congolese did adopt Catholicism, this was mixed with their African beliefs. So this is important too. So while we have people that are adopting Christianity as their religion, they're intermingling their own cultural practices with it. They mix their African indigenous beliefs along with Christianity. Sometimes African spiritual practices were mixed with Abrahamic faiths. Usually the traditions were passed down through oral tradition, hymns, and dances. So this isn't written in the book, but there's actually a video series. The author, Zainab Badawi, she does a great job. I think it's about 20 episodes. They're about 40 minutes to an hour each. And one of the people she interviewed, he spoke about how it's rhythm, periodicity, dancing. These are the ways that we are passing down our religious imperatives, right? It's not through a written word, not through a holy divine scripture. It's vibrations, right? That's how we carry our religious practices on. Now, if you're in the Western world, you think, where is that in the Western world? So we have African Americans. Where is that? To me, that sounds a lot like something called hip hop. It's not something that has holy text, but it's a vibration. It's a frequency. So to conclude, I think it's important when studying the history of Africa, we do so from the point of view of Africans. We're often told it is and was uncivilized and largely participated in brutal and heinous acts to one another. While this may partially be the case, I think this is the Western view, which was used as justification for what would be done for expansion. I hope you guys enjoyed today's video. Make sure you guys like, comment, share, and subscribe. And I look to see you guys in the next one. Have a good one.